Imagine a land of fire and ice, of majestic landscapes, volcanic eruptions, and a history stretching back to the sagas. This is Iceland, a nation known for many things, but in the early 19th century, racial diversity was certainly not one of them. So the story of a black man, not just visiting, but living, working, marrying, and raising a family there during that era is, to say the least, improbable. It's a tale so compelling, it feels like the stuff of novels. His name was Hans Jonatan, a figure who would later be called Iceland's first black citizen. For over 200 years, the full scope of his incredible journey was a trail gone cold, a life story nearly lost to the currents of time. He was born into the brutal system of slavery on a sun-scorched Caribbean island, then a Danish colony. He would fight for his freedom on the streets and in the courts of Copenhagen, the heart of the Danish Empire. And when justice failed him, he vanished, only to reappear in the most unexpected of places, the remote shores of Iceland. This is not just the story of one man's extraordinary life. It's also the story of how that life was painstakingly pieced back together, centuries later, through a remarkable convergence of fading family memories, diligent archival detective work, and the groundbreaking power of modern genetic science. It's a narrative that forces us to confront how easily the histories of individuals, especially those on the margins, can be obscured, and the profound importance of bringing them back into the light. His journey across such dramatically different worlds, from the tropical heat of the Danish West Indies to the sophisticated yet perilous environment of early 19th century Copenhagen, and finally to the stark, isolated beauty of Iceland, speaks volumes about his resilience and an unyielding desire to be free. Hans Jonatan's story begins in 1784 on the Danish colonial island of St. Croix, now part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. He was born into bondage on a sugar plantation known as Constitution Hill. His mother was a woman named Emilia Regina, a house slave. Emilia Regina's own story, like that of so many millions, was one of forced displacement. Her ancestors were likely captured in West Africa and endured the horrific Middle Passage to the Americas. Indeed, a remarkable genetic study in 2018 would later trace her maternal lineage to a region now encompassing Benin, Nigeria, and Cameroon, providing a poignant, tangible link to the heart of the slave trade. The identity of Hans Jonatan's father remains a subject of some uncertainty, but research by the Icelandic anthropologist Gisli Pálsson, in his comprehensive biography, The Man Who Stole Himself, suggests he was a white Dane named Hans Graham, who served as a secretary to Hans Jonatan's owners. Hans himself was noted as being noticeably lighter-skinned than his mother. Life in the Danish West Indies was inextricably tied to the brutal economics of sugar and slavery. These islands were a crucial cog in the vast, exploitative machine of the triangular trade. The enslaved population formed the overwhelming majority, outnumbering Europeans by a staggering margin, in some periods as high as 98% of the populace. Hans Jonatan and his mother were considered the property of Heinrich Ludwig Ernst von Schimmelmann and his wife, Henriette Katharina. Around 1789, when Hans was still a young child, the Schimmelmann family relocated to Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. The plantation business was experiencing a downturn, and it was common practice for wealthy colonial families to bring enslaved individuals with them to serve as domestic staff in the metropole. Emilia Regina was brought over, and Hans Jonatan followed a few years later, around 1792, at about the age of 8. In Copenhagen, Hans became what was termed a house Negro. While this life might have been physically less grueling than the back-breaking labor of the sugar fields, it was still a life devoid of liberty, a life under the constant shadow of ownership. His proximity to the Schimmelmanns, living within their grand household, did not equate to freedom or even basic human dignity in their eyes. After Heinrich Schimmelmann's death, Hans was bequeathed, like any other piece of property, to his widow, Henriette Catherine von Schimmelmann. This stark reality underscores that even in a sophisticated European capital, the status of an enslaved person brought from the colonies remained one of utter subjugation. Any perceived leniency in his treatment was entirely at the whim of his owner, and did nothing to alter his fundamental lack of freedom. Yet, even in these early years, Hans Jonatan displayed a notable adaptability. Growing up in the multicultural environment of St. Croix, he had learned to speak Danish, English, and the local Creole language. This linguistic aptitude would prove to be an invaluable asset as he navigated the vastly different societies he was thrust into. As Hans Jonathan grew into a young man in Copenhagen, a yearning for freedom began to stir within him. He started to push back against his lot in life, as one account describes it, occasionally breaking the strict curfew imposed on him by Henriette Schimmelmann and venturing out into the city, mingling with its diverse inhabitants. These small acts of defiance infuriated Henriette. Then, in 1801, at the age of 16 or 17, a larger opportunity, or perhaps a desperate gamble, presented itself. Denmark was on the verge of war with Great Britain as part of the Napoleonic conflicts. Hans Jonathan decided to enlist in the Royal Danish Navy. This was a bold move, a direct challenge to Henriette's authority. She vehemently forbade it, reportedly even striking the young man with a cane in her anger. But Hans was undeterred. He walked off the Schimmelmann property and joined the Navy anyway. He subsequently fought with acknowledged bravery in the fierce Battle of Copenhagen on April 2, 1801. For his courageous service to Denmark, a glimmer of hope appeared. Crown Prince Frederick, who would later become King Frederick VI, reportedly granted Hans Jonathan his freedom. There's even mention of a formal letter from the Crown Prince arguing that on Danish soil, individuals could only be legally considered slaves if their sentences specifically mandated servitude, which would have effectively recognized Hans's liberty. However, this recognition was short-lived. Henriette Schimmelmann, his owner, refused to accept his emancipation. She had him arrested, asserting her claim that he was her property, and declared her intention to sell him back to the West Indies. Some accounts even suggest she baselessly accused him of theft, a charge that could have carried the death penalty in Denmark at the time, though no evidence supported it. This set the stage for a legal battle that would become infamous in European history. The 1802 case of General Majorinde Henriette de Schimmelmann contra Mulatten Hans Jonathan. Before a Copenhagen court, presided over by the distinguished judge Anders Sandu Orsted, a man who would later rise to become the Prime Minister of Denmark, Hans Jonathan and his lawyer put forth a powerful argument. They contended that while slavery was undeniably legal and deeply entrenched in the Danish West Indian colonies, it was, or should be considered, illegal in Denmark itself. Therefore, Hans Jonathan could not be lawfully held as a slave on Danish soil. This case directly confronted the complex and often contradictory legal status of enslaved individuals brought from the colonies to the European metropole. It's important to understand the legal landscape of the time. Denmark had passed an ordinance in 1792 that would abolish the transatlantic slave trade under the Danish flag, but this ban was not to take effect until 1803. Crucially, this edict did not abolish the institution of slavery itself. Slavery would continue in the Danish colonies until 1848. In fact, the 10-year grace period before the trade ban actually stimulated demand for enslaved people, as planters rushed to acquire more human property. Hans Jonathan's legal argument was, in essence, a test of the free soil principle, the idea that stepping onto the soil of mainland Denmark should render an enslaved person free. Despite his patriotic service in the Battle of Copenhagen, and despite the Crown Prince's apparent initial support for his freedom, the court ruled against him. On March 31, 1802, Judge Orsted delivered the verdict. Hans Jonathan was to be returned to the West Indies, effectively reaffirming Henriette Schimmelmann's property rights over him. He had lost his fight for freedom in the Danish courts. The ruling starkly prioritized the economic interests and established property laws of the colonial elite over any burgeoning concepts of universal human rights, or the notion that Danish soil itself conferred freedom. The power wielded by figures like Henriette Schimmelmann, a general majorinde, from an influential family deeply involved in the colonial enterprise, proved insurmountable within that legal framework. The very nation he had risked his life to defend was now, through its judicial system, condemning him back to the chains of slavery. Facing the horrifying prospect of deportation back to the brutal realities of plantation slavery in the West Indies, Hans Jonatan made a decision that would define the rest of his life and shape his enduring legacy. He refused to submit. He ran away, never to be heard from in Denmark again. In the powerful words of Gisli Paulsen, he stole himself, an act of ultimate defiance, a profound reclamation of his own being from a system that sought to define him as mere chattel. For over 2 centuries, his fate remained a mystery to the Danish authorities who had condemned him. Then, in 1802, the same year as the devastating court ruling, Hans Jonatan surfaced in the most unlikely of places, Djúpivogur, a small trading post and fishing village nestled in a remote fjord on the eastern coast of Iceland. Iceland, like the West Indies, was at this time under Danish rule, a distant part of the Danish kingdom. His arrival must have been remarkable. Early 19th century Iceland was a largely homogeneous society, overwhelmingly rural, its people wresting a living from agriculture and fishing on dispersed farmsteads. While Icelanders were developing their own national consciousness, and were certainly aware of broader European discourses on race and colonialism, the direct daily experience of interacting with a person of African descent would have been virtually unknown. One of the earliest written records of his presence comes from the diary of a Norwegian cartographer named Hans Frisak. On August 4, 1812, Frisak wrote, "The agent at the trading post here is from the West Indies and has no surname, but calls himself Hans Jonatan. He is very dark-skinned and has coal-black, curly hair. His father is European, but his mother a Negro." Significantly, Frisak also noted that he hired Hans Jonatan as a guide, an early indication of the trust and acceptance Hans was able to earn in this new, unfamiliar land. In Iceland, Hans Jonatan carved out a new life. He worked as a peasant farmer at a place called Borgargarður and was also employed at the Danish trading station in Djúpivogur. By 1819, he had risen to take over the running of the trading post itself, a position of considerable responsibility. Surviving Icelandic census records, and even some records from the Djúpivogur store, now preserved in the National Archives in Reykjavik, document his presence, his Caribbean birth, his profession, and note that he was honest about his background. Some of these store records, detailing transactions and stock-taking, are even believed to showcase his tidy Danish-style handwriting. He didn't just find work, he found a home and a family. By February 1820, Hans Jonatan married an Icelandic woman, Katrín Antoniusdóttir, from a farm called Hals. Together, they had 3 children, 2 of whom, a son and a daughter, survived to adulthood and had children of their own. He became known as a well-liked shopkeeper and a revered member of the community. This integration is remarkable. In Iceland, a remote island on the periphery of the Danish Empire, a place far removed from the racialized plantation economies, Hans Jonatan seems to have been judged more on his character and abilities than solely on his skin color or origins. Perhaps the very homogeneity and isolation of Iceland, ironically, created a space where the rigid racial categorizations prevalent elsewhere were less strictly applied, allowing him to build a life. He died in Iceland on December 18, 1827, at the age of 43, a free man who had successfully forged a new identity in a new world. His final resting place, however, remains unlocated. Despite the quiet stability he found, his journey was a testament to an extraordinary resilience, culminating in the establishment of a lineage that continues to this day, a quiet but profound legacy of a man who dared to claim his own life. For nearly 2 centuries after his death in 1827, the full, astonishing story of Hans Jonatan, his birth in chains, his fight for freedom, his daring escape, and his improbable life in Iceland, largely faded from wider historical consciousness. Outside of Iceland, and particularly to the Danish administration he had eluded, his fate remained unknown. Within Iceland, fragments of his memory were preserved, primarily through family lore passed down through generations. The painstaking process of rediscovery began to gain momentum around the 1990s. A pivotal figure in this historical detective work is Gisli Paulsen, an Icelandic anthropologist. His meticulous research, described by one reviewer as wondrous sleuthing, involved piecing together a life that had been hidden for centuries in the memories of an Icelandic family. This research culminated in his acclaimed biography, First published in Icelandic in 2014 as Maðurinn sem stal sjálfum sér, and later in English in 2016 as The Man Who Stole Himself, The Slave Odyssey of Hans Jonathan. A fascinating element of this family memory, beautifully recounted in the prologue to Paulsson's book, centers on Dagny Ingimundardóttir, Hans Jonathan's great-great-granddaughter. Living in the Westman Islands, Dagny had a powerful dream of a black ancestress who brought her roses and thanked her for thinking affectionately of her. This dream deeply affected her and spurred her grandson to begin investigating the family's origins. Gradually, through his efforts in searching archives abroad and with contributions from other family members, the extraordinary connection was made. The respected, dark-complexioned Icelandic shopkeeper Hans Jonathan was one and the same as the young enslaved boy who had once lived under the stairs in a grand house in Copenhagen. This intersection of deeply personal, almost mystical family remembrance with rigorous archival investigation highlights how such lost histories often persist in non-traditional forms before being brought to broader light. Earlier public discourse in Iceland also hinted at his story. An article titled Trailblazer, Slave Islands, by Elín Pálmadóttir, published in the Icelandic newspaper Morgunblaðið in 1994, is cited in connection with Hans Jonathan. While the precise contents of this article are not fully detailed in the available materials, its publication in the mid-1990s suggests an emerging public awareness or discussion of his unique history in Iceland, likely drawing from or contributing to these family memories and the initial phases of scholarly research. The archival detective work was extensive. Researchers like Paulsson scoured records across nations. In Danish archives, they found court records from the pivotal 1802 slavery case. In Iceland, a wealth of local records proved invaluable. Census documents from Djúpivogur listed Hans Jonathan, noting his Caribbean birth and his profession as a merchant. Significantly, he was honest about his background in these official listings. Account books and memoranda from the Djúpivogur trading store, detailing transactions with customers, stock-taking, and other aspects of his work, also survived, some possibly bearing his own neat Danish handwriting, and are now housed in the National Archives in Reykjavik. These mundane administrative documents, never intended as biographical records, became crucial puzzle pieces. Further Icelandic records noted his donations to the poor in 1808 and his participation in a district council meeting in 1810, where his modest assets were listed as a ewe, 3 yearling lambs, and a horse. Beyond official documents, contemporary personal accounts provided further glimpses. The 1812 diary entry of the Norwegian cartographer Hans Frisak, who hired Hans as a guide, offered a direct contemporary description. Memoirs of a Scottish preacher and a Danish friend also mentioned Hans Jonathan by name, recalling his helpfulness in navigating the local terrain. The perspectives of these outsiders were particularly valuable, as they recorded details about Hans that might have been taken for granted or left unwritten by the local community. Even earlier academic work, such as a 1964 article by Danish law professor Knud Waben, reviewing the unresolved legal cases of Hans Jonathan and another enslaved man, played a part in preventing the story from vanishing completely from scholarly view. More recently, comprehensive narratives like the article A Trail Gone Cold have synthesized these historical findings with the genetic discoveries, bringing his story to new audiences, alongside various podcasts and shorter pieces that continue to explore his remarkable life. Then, in 2018, the story of Hans Jonathan took another astonishing turn, this time in the realm of cutting-edge science. An international team of researchers, including scientists from Decode Genetics in Reykjavik and the University of Iceland, achieved a remarkable breakthrough. They reconstructed a significant portion of Hans Jonathan's genome without any of his physical remains. This was a landmark achievement, the first time such a feat had been accomplished for a historical individual whose body was lost to time. The groundbreaking study, led by first author Anuradha Jagadisan and involving prominent figures like Carrie Stefansson of Decode Genetics, was published in the prestigious journal Nature Genetics under the title Reconstructing an African Haploid Genome from the 18th Century. The methodology was ingenious. researchers first identified 788 living descendants of Hans Jonathan. From this group, they collected DNA samples from 182 individuals. Using advanced techniques such as single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, chips for genotyping, and whole genome sequencing for a smaller subset of 20 descendants, the scientists were able to identify specific segments of chromosomes that were likely inherited from Hans Jonathan's African maternal line. This complex task was significantly aided by several factors unique to Iceland's population. The extreme rarity of African genetic heritage, meaning any such markers would stand out, the relative genetic homogeneity of the Icelandic people, and, crucially, the existence of comprehensive genealogical records and extensive genomic databases, largely compiled by Decode Genetics. Iceland, in this context, served as a kind of natural laboratory for this type of ancestral reconstruction. The findings were nothing short of revolutionary for Hans Jonathan's story. The scientists successfully reconstructed approximately 38% of his mother Emilia Regina's maternal genome, her mitochondrial DNA, and parts of her X chromosome and autosomes passed down to him. This, in turn, allowed them to reconstruct about 19% of Hans Jonathan's own genome. Most significantly, this genetic blueprint pinpointed Emilia Regina's ancestral origins to a region in West Africa that today encompasses Benin, Nigeria, and Cameroon. This provided a direct, irrefutable genetic link from Hans Jonathan, the Icelandic farmer, back to the very heart of the regions devastated by the transatlantic slave trade. The research also confirmed European genetic origins on his father's side, aligning with the historical accounts. This scientific validation did not just confirm what was suspected, it added a profound layer of detail and certainty, transforming Emilia Regina from a name in an archive to a woman with a traceable connection to specific West African peoples, and giving Hans Jonathan a scientifically grounded ancestral homeland on the African continent. It powerfully demonstrated how genetics can serve as a tool to reclaim lost histories, giving a voice through DNA to those silenced by the past. Hans Jonathan's life was, by any measure, extraordinary. From the brutal subjugation of a Caribbean sugar plantation to the halls of a Danish court, from the valor of a naval battle to the quiet dignity of a life built anew on the shores of Iceland, his journey is a testament to an indomitable spirit. His decision to steel himself in the face of re-enslavement was an ultimate act of courage and self-affirmation, a defiant assertion of his own humanity. His intelligence, evidenced by his linguistic abilities and the competence he showed as a merchant, and his resilience in adapting to vastly different cultures, allowed him not just to survive, but to thrive and be respected in his final home. But his story resonates far beyond the personal. His life serves as a powerful lens through which we can examine some of history's most profound and troubling themes. The mechanics of imperialism and colonial exploitation, the brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade, the complex and often contradictory legal arguments surrounding slavery, the pervasive influence of 19th century racial ideologies, and the enduring, universal quest for human rights. As one review of Gisli Pálsson's biography aptly put it, Hans Jonathan's story puts the monstrous on a human scale, allowing us to connect with the vast historical forces of slavery and colonialism through the lived experience of a single remarkable man. He stood as an individual against a vast, oppressive system, and his choices to enlist, to argue his case, to escape, were all acts of resistance that carved out a space of freedom not only for himself but for the generations that followed. Today, Hans Jonathan's legacy is tangible. Nearly 900 to over 1,000 descendants, primarily in Iceland and North America, carry his genetic and historical inheritance. In Iceland, he has become something of an Icelandic icon, a proud and daring ancestor whose story is increasingly recognized and celebrated. There has even been public discussion about erecting a statue in his honor, a testament to his unique place in the nation's history. His narrative continues to inspire and educate through books like Pálsson's definitive biography, articles such as A Trail Gone Cold, documentaries, and even a musical, En Fri Mand, A Free Man, performed in Denmark in 2023. The rediscovery and embrace of Hans Jonathan's story also contribute to a richer, more nuanced understanding of Iceland's own national narrative. challenging older notions of homogeneity by incorporating this early, remarkable instance of multicultural heritage. It prompts a deeper reflection on Iceland's historical position within the broader Danish colonial system and its connections to global histories of race and migration. While Hans Jonathan found his personal freedom, the ongoing telling and retelling of his story, the scholarly research, the scientific breakthroughs, and the public recognition are all part of a larger vital process of historical justice, ensuring that such lives are not forgotten, that the complexities of the past are confronted, and that the human spirit's relentless pursuit of freedom is honored. His journey, spanning continents and centuries, reminds us of our interconnected histories and the enduring power of one individual to carve a path toward liberty against formidable odds.